During World War II, the United States Navy was a microcosm of American society, reflecting both its strength and its profound inequalities. While millions of Americans fought overseas, African American sailors were largely confined to menial and dangerous tasks. Black servicemen were systematically excluded from combat roles and technical positions. The majority were assigned to the Navy's segregated stevedore battalions, responsible for loading and unloading ammunition, supplies, and ordnance at ports across the country. Port Chicago was one of these ports, a vital hub sending weapons and munitions to the Pacific theater, yet it was also a place where racial policies compounded the inherent dangers of war. Most black sailors had little or no formal training in handling high explosives. They were supervised by white officers who rarely participated in the manual labor themselves. This arrangement reflected a broader distrust of black sailors' capabilities, rooted in systemic racism rather than evidence or ability. Officers often encouraged speed, framing it as efficiency and patriotism, yet providing no safety measures to match the risk. The disparity was clear. White sailors and officers avoided direct exposure to the most volatile cargo, while black sailors bore the brunt of lethal labor. As the war intensified, the pressure increased. Orders to load ships came with strict deadlines, and black sailors were expected to meet them without complaint. Many were young men, often teenagers, far from home, juggling fear and duty. The Navy's structure left them vulnerable, not just to accidents, but to discrimination and mistreatment. Even basic protections like proper training in ammunition handling or safety equipment were inadequate or ignored. The environment created constant tension, a mix of fear, anger, and resignation. Sailors described being forced to work faster, sometimes racing each other while carrying tons of explosives, aware that one misstep could be fatal. Their courage was taken for granted, their labor undervalued. The segregation policies of the Navy were not unique to Port Chicago, but the tragedy there amplified the consequences of these systemic injustices. It revealed how racial hierarchy intertwined with wartime necessity, turning a strategic port into a place of profound danger for those assigned to do the hardest work. The tragedy at Port Chicago was not an isolated accident. It was the inevitable outcome of a system that placed prejudice above safety and efficiency above humanity. Understanding the segregated structure of the Navy is essential to grasp why the disaster unfolded as it did, and why the survivors' refusal to return to loading munitions became an act of both courage and protest. During World War II, the United States Navy was a microcosm of American society, reflecting both its strength and its profound inequalities. While millions of Americans fought overseas, African American sailors were largely confined to menial and dangerous tasks. Black servicemen were systematically excluded from combat roles and technical positions. The majority were assigned to the Navy's segregated stevedore battalions, responsible for loading and unloading ammunition, supplies, and ordnance at ports across the country. Port Chicago was one of these ports, a vital hub sending weapons and munitions to the Pacific theater. Yet it was also a place where racial policies compounded the inherent dangers of war. Most black sailors had little or no formal training in handling high explosives. They were supervised by white officers who rarely participated in the manual labor themselves. This arrangement reflected a broader distrust of black sailors' capabilities, rooted in systemic racism rather than evidence or ability. Officers often encouraged speed, framing it as efficiency and patriotism, yet providing no safety measures to match the risk. The disparity was clear. White sailors and officers avoided direct exposure to the most volatile cargo, while black sailors bore the brunt of lethal labor. As the war intensified, the pressure increased. Orders to load ships came with strict deadlines, and black sailors were expected to meet them without complaint. Many were young men, often teenagers, far from home, juggling fear and duty. The Navy's structure left them vulnerable, not just to accidents, but to discrimination and mistreatment. Even basic protections like proper training and ammunition handling or safety equipment were inadequate or ignored. The environment created constant tension, a mix of fear, anger, and resignation. Sailors described being forced to work faster, sometimes racing each other while carrying tons of explosives, aware that one misstep could be fatal. Their courage was taken for granted, their labor undervalued. The segregation policies of the Navy were not unique to Port Chicago, but the tragedy there amplified the consequences of these systemic injustices. It revealed how racial hierarchy intertwined with wartime necessity, turning a strategic port into a place of profound danger for those assigned to do the hardest work. The tragedy at Port Chicago was not an isolated accident. It was the inevitable outcome of a system that placed prejudice above safety and efficiency above humanity. Understanding the segregated structure of the Navy is essential to grasp why the disaster unfolded as it did, and why the survivors' refusal to return to loading munitions became an act of both courage and protest. The work at Port Chicago was relentless, exhausting, and deadly. Each day, black sailors faced the daunting task of moving tons of high explosives from storage magazines onto ships bound for the Pacific Theater. The cargo included bombs, artillery shells, depth charges, and other munitions, each capable of detonating with the slightest mistake. Many sailors had no formal training in handling these weapons. They learned on the job, often through trial and error under the constant supervision of white officers who themselves rarely touched the explosives. The men worked long hours in sweltering heat, sometimes lifting heavy ordnance repeatedly without proper equipment or safety measures. The stakes were unimaginably high. One dropped shell, one misstep, or one improperly secured load could trigger an explosion. It was not just theoretical danger, it was a real and constant threat. Every sailor understood that each shift could be their last. Orders emphasized speed above all else. White officers encouraged competition among the men, framing it as efficiency and patriotism. Sailors were timed as they loaded crates, racing against each other to move cargo faster, ignoring the ever-present risk of catastrophe. Many men feared the work but felt trapped. They were told that refusal could lead to disciplinary action, even imprisonment, and in some cases they faced overt intimidation or ridicule. Equipment was often inadequate. Pallets and cranes were poorly maintained, and protective gear was limited or non-existent. Heat, exhaustion, and fear became part of daily life. Over time, sailors developed routines to cope with the stress. Some relied on humor, others on camaraderie, and some tried to distance themselves emotionally from the danger. But no strategy could eliminate the inherent risk of the job. Accidents were common, though rarely fatal, until the night of July 17, 1944. Sailors had witnessed small explosions, fires, and near misses before, yet each day they returned to the docks, performing tasks that would terrify anyone outside the military system. The disparity between the men's contribution and the recognition they received was stark. Black sailors were doing the most dangerous work in a segregated military, bearing the heaviest burden of war effort while receiving minimal support and respect. The combination of systemic racism, inadequate training, and high-pressure demands created a perfect storm of risk and injustice. This environment, both oppressive and perilous, set the stage for the tragedy that would claim hundreds of lives and forever change the way Americans understood the human cost of war at home. The dangerous work at Port Chicago was more than labor. It was a test of courage, endurance, and the limits of human survival under conditions deliberately made unsafe by a segregated system. On the night of July 17, 1944, The small naval port of Port Chicago, California, was quiet. Just before 10:20 p.m., the silence shattered. Two cargo ships, loaded with thousands of tons of ammunition bound for the Pacific Theater, erupted in a blinding flash. The explosion was so powerful it registered as a seismic event. Windows shattered miles away. Ships were vaporized. 320 sailors and civilians were killed instantly. Most of the dead were young African-American enlisted men. They had been assigned to load bombs, depth charges, and artillery shells onto ships under intense pressure. Many had received little formal training. Segregation was the rule in the United States Navy at the time. Black sailors were largely restricted to labor battalions. They handled the explosives. White officers supervised. In the hours before the blast, some of the men had reportedly been encouraged to compete, loading ammunition faster and faster. Speed was seen as efficiency. Efficiency was patriotism. When the ships detonated, bodies were torn apart. Entire sections of the pier vanished. Survivors described a fireball rising into the night sky. For many families, there would be no remains to bury. But the tragedy did not end with the explosion. Weeks later, 258 surviving sailors were ordered back to loading ammunition under similar conditions. 50 of them refused. They said they were afraid. They said it was unsafe. The Navy charged them with mutiny. It was one of the largest mutiny trials in U.S. naval history. Civil rights advocates, including future Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall, monitored the proceedings. The case exposed not only unsafe wartime practices, but the racial divisions within America's armed forces. The Port Chicago disaster would later be recognized as a turning point, one that contributed to the eventual desegregation of the U.S. military. For decades, the story remained largely absent from mainstream history. Tonight, we examine what happened at Port Chicago and why its legacy still matters. By late November 1942, the battle for Stalingrad had reached a breaking point. While German forces remained deeply engaged in urban combat inside the ruins of the city, Soviet command had completed preparations for a large-scale counter-offensive. The German army's focus on capturing Stalingrad had left its flanks weak and poorly defended, especially in the open steppe regions north and south of the city. These positions were held primarily by Allied Axis forces, including Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian units, who lacked the equipment and defensive strength needed to resist a major armored assault. On November 19, 1942, the Soviet counteroffensive began. Operation Uranus was launched with overwhelming force. Massive artillery bombardments were followed by coordinated tank and infantry attacks against the German flanks. Soviet armored units broke through defensive lines rapidly, advancing through weakly held positions and overwhelming Axis forces. The speed and scale of the assault shocked German command. Within days, Soviet forces had penetrated deep behind German lines. By November 23rd, Soviet armored units linked up near the town of Kalitch-on-Don. This maneuver completed the encirclement of the German 6th Army and parts of the 4th Panzer Army inside Stalingrad. More than 250,000 Axis soldiers were now trapped inside the city and its surrounding ruins. Supply routes were cut. Escape routes were closed. The German forces were completely surrounded. German command faced a critical decision. Field commanders requested permission to break out of the encirclement while there was still a chance. However, Adolf Hitler refused to authorize a retreat. He issued direct orders that Stalingrad must be held at all costs. The German army was instructed to remain in position and wait for relief forces that would attempt to break the encirclement from the outside. This decision sealed the fate of the trapped army. German leadership promised that the surrounded forces would be supplied by air. The Luftwaffe attempted to deliver food, ammunition, fuel, and medical supplies by aircraft. In reality, the airlift was completely inadequate. Weather conditions, Soviet air defenses, and limited transport capacity made large-scale resupply impossible. Only a fraction of the required supplies reached the encircled troops. Inside the pocket, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Food shortages became extreme. Soldiers survived on starvation rations that provided only a fraction of daily nutritional needs. Horses were slaughtered for meat. In some areas, soldiers consumed leather, belts, and equipment materials in desperate attempts to survive. Malnutrition weakened immune systems and accelerated the spread of disease. Medical care collapsed. Hospitals were overcrowded, understaffed, and undersupplied. Wounded soldiers were left untreated. Many died from infections, exposure, or untreated injuries rather than combat wounds. Medical staff were overwhelmed and exhausted, unable to manage the scale of suffering. Fuel shortages made heating impossible. Soldiers lived in freezing conditions inside destroyed buildings and makeshift shelters. Frostbite became widespread. Entire units lost combat effectiveness due to cold-related injuries. Weapons froze and malfunctioned. Vehicles became unusable. The winter environment turned survival into a daily struggle. Psychological collapse followed physical collapse. Morale disintegrated. Many soldiers lost the will to fight. Discipline weakened. Desertions increased. Some soldiers surrendered voluntarily to Soviet forces simply to escape starvation and freezing. The belief in rescue faded as days passed without relief. Outside the encirclement, German relief operations failed. Attempts to break through Soviet lines were repelled. Soviet defenses were well organized and heavily reinforced. The Red Army maintained pressure on the encircled forces while tightening the ring around them. By January 1943, the German position inside Stalingrad was unsustainable. The encircled army had been split into smaller pockets. Communication between units broke down. Command structures collapsed. Organized resistance weakened. soldiers were physically incapable of sustained combat. On January 31, 1943, the southern group of the German Sixth Army surrendered. 2 days later, on February 2, 1943, the remaining northern group also surrendered. The Battle of Stalingrad officially ended. Approximately 90,000 German soldiers were taken prisoner. Only a small fraction would ever return home. The rest died in captivity due to disease, starvation, and harsh conditions. The scale of destruction was unprecedented. Stalingrad was almost completely destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians had died. Entire neighborhoods had been erased. The city was reduced to ruins. Strategically, the defeat at Stalingrad marked a turning point in the Second World War. It was the first complete destruction of a German field army. The myth of German military invincibility was shattered. Momentum on the Eastern Front shifted decisively in favor of the Soviet Union. From this point forward, German forces would be pushed steadily westward. Politically and psychologically, the impact was immense. Allied nations gained confidence. Axis morale collapsed. The balance of power in Europe began to change. However, the true legacy of Stalingrad was not only strategic, it was human. The battle demonstrated the extreme limits of human endurance. It revealed the cost of ideological war fought without restraint. It showed how cities could become graveyards and how soldiers could become victims of decisions made far from the battlefield. Stalingrad became a symbol not only of military defeat, but of human suffering on an unimaginable scale. The city was rebuilt after the war, but the memory of the battle remains embedded in history as one of the darkest chapters of human conflict. The ruins were cleared, the buildings were reconstructed, but the ground itself remained a mass grave. The Battle of Stalingrad stands as a warning about what happens when power, ambition, and ideology override humanity. It is remembered not only as a military turning point, but as a testament to the cost of war when human life becomes secondary to victory. When the Navy ordered the surviving sailors back to the docks at Port Chicago, a moment of profound courage and moral reckoning unfolded. 50 men, most of them African American, refused to return to loading ammunition under the same perilous conditions that had claimed hundreds of their comrades. Their decision was not made lightly. Each man had witnessed the explosion, seen friends vaporized, and felt the lingering fear of a repeat disaster. Returning to the docks meant confronting death again. Their refusal was an act of self-preservation, but it also became a symbol of resistance against systemic injustice. The Navy, unprepared for this kind of defiance, labeled it mutiny, the gravest charge a sailor could face. Arrests were made swiftly, and the men were confined, facing intense questioning and the threat of severe punishment. Word of the refusal spread, igniting debate within the Navy and the broader public. Some viewed the sailors' actions as cowardice, a betrayal of duty. Others, including civil rights advocates, saw courage and a justified response to unsafe conditions compounded by racial discrimination. The men themselves were clear about their motives. They feared for their lives and demanded basic safety standards that should have been in place from the beginning. This refusal challenged the Navy's authority and forced military leaders to confront uncomfortable truths about the treatment of black sailors. It exposed the intersection of race, labor, and wartime urgency, highlighting the disparity between the risks assigned to African American sailors and the protections afforded to white officers. The men's stance became a focal point in the months that followed, drawing national attention to Port Chicago and the systemic inequities of the U.S. military. Families of the sailors grappled with pride and anxiety, knowing their loved ones had taken a stand that could result in imprisonment or worse. Newspapers reported the events, often framing them within narratives of discipline and order, but some journalists and activists began to question the fairness of the Navy's response. The refusal was more than a protest against unsafe working conditions. It was a moral challenge to a segregated system that demanded obedience while endangering lives. In the face of potential punishment, these 50 men embodied resilience and principle. Their decision would resonate far beyond the docks of Port Chicago, influencing legal proceedings, civil rights advocacy, and eventually contributing to the conversation that led to the desegregation of the U.S. military. The refusal stands as a testament to the courage required to confront injustice, even within one's own government and military, and to demand accountability in the midst of war. Following the refusal at Port Chicago, the Navy moved quickly to assert its authority. The 50 sailors who had declined to return to loading ammunition were formally arrested and charged with mutiny, a grave offense punishable by long imprisonment or even death. Military police detained the men, many of whom were still grappling with the trauma of the explosion they had survived. The arrests were carried out under strict supervision, with sailors confined to secure facilities facing limited contact with family or legal counsel. The news of the arrests spread throughout the base and nearby communities, fueling tension and uncertainty. Families of the arrested men were terrified, unsure of their loved ones' fate. The sailors themselves endured harsh conditions while awaiting trial. Confined and closely monitored, they had little opportunity to prepare a defense or even communicate freely. Psychological pressure weighed heavily on them, compounded by the memory of the lives lost in the disaster. The Navy emphasized discipline and obedience, framing the men's refusal as a direct challenge to military order. Official communications painted the incident as a necessary enforcement of authority, downplaying the legitimate safety concerns that had motivated the sailors' actions. Legal proceedings were initiated rapidly, reflecting both the urgency of wartime protocol and the desire to set an example. The arrests were unprecedented in scale, involving the largest mutiny case in U.S. naval history at that time. Civil rights advocates, aware of the racial dynamics at play, began to scrutinize the case. They questioned whether black sailors had been disproportionately assigned to dangerous work, and whether their fear and refusal constituted a reasonable response to unsafe conditions. The contrast between the Navy's rigid enforcement and the men's human concerns became increasingly apparent. Communities around Port Chicago followed developments closely, some offering support, others echoing the official narrative of duty and discipline. The arrests marked a turning point. What began as a protest against unsafe labor conditions had escalated into a national story about race, authority, and justice during wartime. For the sailors, the consequences were immediate and life-altering. The confinement and looming trial introduced new challenges, testing their resilience and determination. The arrests also signaled to the Navy and the public that the story of Port Chicago was far from over. It was no longer only about a tragic explosion. It had become a story of courage, protest, and the struggle for accountability in the face of systemic injustice. The men's experience highlighted the tension between military hierarchy and human rights, raising questions that would echo long after the trial concluded. The mutiny trial at Port Chicago became one of the most significant and controversial proceedings in U.S. naval history. 50 African-American sailors faced charges for refusing to return to loading ammunition after the catastrophic explosion that had killed hundreds of their comrades. The trial opened under intense scrutiny, both within the Navy and across the nation. Courtrooms were crowded with military officials, journalists, and observers, all aware that the outcome would carry implications far beyond the individuals on trial. The prosecution argued that the men had deliberately disobeyed orders, challenging the authority of the Navy at a critical point in the war. They portrayed the refusal as a deliberate act of insubordination, emphasizing the need for discipline and obedience. The defense, however, highlighted the extreme danger the sailors faced. They argued that the men's fear was reasonable given the unsafe working conditions, inadequate training, and the deadly explosion they had survived. The trial became a moral and legal battleground, raising questions about accountability, race, and justice within the military. Testimonies from survivors were harrowing, recounting the horror of the explosion, the loss of friends, and the fear that gripped every shift back on the docks. Witnesses described the lack of proper safety measures and the pressure to work at a dangerous pace under white officers' supervision. Observers noted that the racial dynamics of the Navy heavily influenced the proceedings. African American sailors were disproportionately assigned to high-risk labor, while white officers were largely insulated from danger. The trial examined not only the act of refusal, but the systemic inequities that led to the disaster in the first place. Outside the courtroom, civil rights advocates, including Thurgood Marshall, followed the case closely. They understood that the outcome could set a precedent for how Black servicemen were treated and whether their concerns about safety could be considered legitimate. Families of the accused lived in anxiety, fearing severe punishment for acts born of fear and survival instinct. The court's decisions would test the Navy's balance between maintaining authority and acknowledging human limitations. The Port Chicago Mutiny trial remains a powerful reminder of the costs of systemic inequity and the resilience of those who dared to challenge it. The Port Chicago Mutiny trial drew the attention of civil rights advocates, most notably Thurgood Marshall, who was then the lead attorney for the NAACP. Marshall recognized the case as far more than a military dispute. It was a profound challenge to racial injustice in the armed forces. The 50 African American sailors had refused to return to loading munitions under deadly conditions, and Marshall understood that their actions were rooted in both fear and reason. He closely monitored the trial, attending hearings, reviewing evidence, and preparing legal commentary to support the sailors' cause. Marshall and his colleagues argued that the Navy's policies had placed Black sailors in disproportionately hazardous roles while providing minimal training and no safety assurances. The structural racism within the Navy, he emphasized, had directly contributed to the explosion and the sailors' refusal to comply with orders. Through careful analysis of the trial transcripts, Marshall highlighted inconsistencies in the prosecution's narrative. Witnesses had described unsafe conditions, lack of proper supervision, and coercive practices that pressured men to work faster than safely possible. These points were crucial in framing the sailors' refusal not as mutiny, but as a rational response to systemic negligence. The public and media began to pay closer attention. Coverage of Marshall's involvement brought a civil rights perspective to the story, exposing the racial inequities of the military and the broader implications for justice in wartime. Families of the sailors gained a voice as Marshall's advocacy ensured that their concerns were represented and not ignored. While the trial proceeded under strict military authority, the presence of a respected civil rights figure introduced moral and legal scrutiny that could not be easily dismissed. Marshall's involvement also resonated beyond the courtroom. It helped raise awareness of the challenges faced by African American servicemen across the Navy and other branches of the military, shining a light on segregation, discrimination, and the unequal risks imposed on Black soldiers. His advocacy laid the groundwork for future reforms, including the eventual desegregation of the U.S. Armed Forces under President Truman. Thurgood Marshall's engagement with the Port Chicago case demonstrated the intersection of civil rights and military justice. It highlighted how the courage of a few sailors, combined with determined legal support, could challenge entrenched systems of inequality. By bringing national attention to the sailors' plight, Marshall ensured that their story became not only a tale of tragedy, but also one of moral courage, resilience, and the fight for justice in the face of systemic oppression. As news of the Port Chicago explosion and the subsequent mutiny trial spread across the country, public reaction developed gradually. At first, headlines focused primarily on the magnitude of the blast itself. Newspapers described shattered docks, destroyed ships, and the staggering loss of life. It was portrayed as a tragic wartime accident, an unfortunate but isolated event during a global conflict. Few early reports examined the deeper causes behind the disaster or the racial dynamics within the Navy. Within African American communities, however, the reaction carried a different weight. The deaths of hundreds of black sailors and the prosecution of 50 survivors were seen not simply as military matters, but as evidence of systemic inequality. Black newspapers questioned why African American servicemen had been assigned to such dangerous work without adequate training or safeguards. Editorials asked whether fear for one's life could truly be defined as mutiny, especially after witnessing a catastrophic explosion. Civil rights organizations began to monitor the case closely, recognizing its broader implications. Among the wider American public, opinions were divided. Some believed strict discipline was necessary during wartime and accepted the Navy's position without question. In an era defined by national unity against foreign enemies, obedience was often viewed as essential to victory. Others, particularly those attentive to civil rights issues, expressed unease. Letters to editors and community discussions reflected growing discomfort about the fairness of the trial and the conditions that had led to the sailors' refusal. The federal government faced a sensitive situation. It needed to preserve public confidence in the armed forces while also responding to increasing scrutiny. The case raised difficult questions about whether a segregated military could truly represent democratic ideals. Could a nation fighting against tyranny abroad justify inequality within its own ranks? As the trial progressed, coverage expanded, and the story of Port Chicago reached a broader audience. The disaster evolved from a local tragedy into a national conversation about race, labor, and justice. Public reaction did not erupt in mass protest, but it steadily influenced the dialogue surrounding military policy and civil rights. The tension between authority and accountability became more visible. Port Chicago revealed cracks beneath the surface of wartime unity. It challenged Americans to consider whether discipline alone could define justice. The public response, though measured and sometimes cautious, marked the beginning of a shift in awareness, one that would contribute to larger changes in the years to come. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the court reached its decision. The 50 sailors charged with mutiny stood before a military panel that would determine not only their fate, but the message the Navy intended to send. The atmosphere inside the courtroom was tense and restrained. For the accused, the verdict would define their futures. For the Navy, it was a matter of authority and discipline during wartime. The court ultimately found all 50 men guilty of mutiny. Sentences ranged up to 15 years of hard labor, along with dishonorable discharges and forfeiture of pay. Though the death penalty was not imposed, the punishments were severe. The ruling reinforced the Navy's position that refusal to obey orders, regardless of circumstance, could not be tolerated. Official statements framed the verdict as necessary to preserve order and operational readiness in a time of global conflict. For the sailors, the sentencing was a devastating blow. Many had believed their fears were justified, that the horror they had survived would be taken into account. Instead, the court's decision signaled that institutional authority outweighed personal safety. Families of the convicted men were left to absorb the consequences. Sons and husbands who had volunteered to serve their country were now labeled mutineers. The stigma of dishonorable discharge would follow them long after their prison terms ended. Outside the courtroom, civil rights advocates expressed deep concern. Observers questioned whether the trial had fully considered the unsafe conditions that led to the refusal. Critics argued that the Navy had prosecuted the symptom, defiance, without fully addressing the cause, systemic inequality and negligence. The verdict intensified debates about racial discrimination within the military and the broader contradiction of fighting for freedom abroad while denying equality at home. Despite the harsh sentences, pressure from advocacy groups and public scrutiny began to influence higher authorities. Over time, most of the convicted sailors were quietly released and reassigned, though their convictions initially remained. The Navy sought to move forward, restoring operations and minimizing further controversy. Yet, the sentencing at Port Chicago left an indelible mark. It underscored the rigid boundaries of military hierarchy and exposed the cost of challenging it. The men who stood trial had acted out of fear and conscience, and their punishment revealed the limits of dissent within a segregated institution. In the years that followed, the memory of their sentencing would contribute to calls for reform, shaping conversations about justice, equality, and the responsibilities of leadership in times of crisis. To understand the full significance of Port Chicago, it is essential to examine the military policies that shaped life for African American servicemen during World War II. At the time, the United States Armed Forces operated under strict racial segregation. Black service members were separated into distinct units, often assigned labor-intensive or support roles rather than combat or technical positions. This structure reflected long-standing societal prejudices rather than measured assessments of ability or performance. In the Navy, African American sailors were frequently limited to roles such as cooks, stewards, or manual laborers. The opportunity to rise in rank or receive specialized training was severely restricted. White officers commanded nearly all units, reinforcing a hierarchy that mirrored segregation in civilian life. The belief that black sailors were unsuited for leadership or complex tasks persisted despite evidence to the contrary. This systemic limitation meant that when dangerous assignments arose, such as loading ammunition at Port Chicago, black sailors were disproportionately selected. Military leadership defended segregation as a matter of tradition and order. They argued that separate units preserved discipline and minimized internal conflict. Yet this policy often produced the opposite effect. By denying equal training and opportunity, the system created resentment and deepened divisions. The events at Port Chicago exposed how segregation could magnify risk. When inexperienced and inadequately trained men were tasked with handling volatile explosives under intense pressure, the consequences could be catastrophic. The broader wartime context also shaped policy decisions. With global conflict escalating, efficiency was prioritized above nearly all else. Speed, production, and rapid deployment of supplies were essential to sustaining operations overseas. Safety protocols were sometimes compromised in the pursuit of these goals. For black sailors, who already faced discriminatory treatment, the pressure was compounded by limited recourse or advocacy within the chain of command. Public awareness of these policies was limited at the time. Many Americans were focused on the war effort and trusted military leadership to act responsibly. However, incidents like Port Chicago forced the nation to confront the contradictions inherent in its system. How could a country fighting fascism and racial supremacy abroad maintain segregation within its own ranks? The policies in place during World War II did not emerge overnight, nor did they disappear quickly. But the disaster at Port Chicago revealed their human cost. It demonstrated that segregation was not merely a social arrangement, it had life and death consequences. The trial and its aftermath began to challenge the assumption that such policies were sustainable. In examining military policy at the time, one sees clearly that Port Chicago was not an isolated failure. It was the predictable outcome of a system built on inequality. The events at Port Chicago did not immediately dismantle segregation within the United States military, but they contributed to a growing pressure that could no longer be ignored. As World War II moved toward its conclusion, the contradiction between America's democratic ideals and its segregated armed forces became increasingly visible. Black servicemen had fought, labored, and sacrificed across every theater of war, yet they returned home to discrimination and limited opportunity. The Port Chicago trial had amplified these tensions, exposing how racial inequality could endanger not only individual lives, but the integrity of the military itself. Civil rights organizations intensified their calls for reform. They argued that efficiency, morale, and justice were incompatible with segregation. The courage of the sailors who refused unsafe orders became part of a broader narrative demanding accountability. Their case joined other wartime incidents that highlighted unequal treatment within the ranks. Public awareness was gradual, but momentum was building. Political leaders began to recognize that maintaining a segregated military undermined the nation's credibility on the global stage. By the late 1940s, the issue reached the highest levels of government. Pressure from activists, veterans, and community leaders converged with strategic concerns about national unity and international reputation. The emerging Cold War placed new emphasis on presenting the United States as a model of freedom and equality. Racial segregation within the armed forces stood in direct opposition to that image. In 1948, President Harry S. Truman signed Executive Order 9981, mandating the desegregation of the U.S. Armed Forces. The order declared that there would be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the military, regardless of race, color, religion, or national origin. Though implementation was gradual and met with resistance, the directive marked a decisive shift in policy. It acknowledged that segregation was incompatible with American principles and military effectiveness. The legacy of Port Chicago played a subtle but meaningful role in this transformation. The disaster had forced the nation to confront the human cost of discriminatory policies. It demonstrated that inequality was not merely unjust, it was dangerous. The sailors' refusal, trial, and sentencing had revealed the strain placed on men asked to risk their lives within a system that denied them dignity. Desegregation did not erase the pain endured at Port Chicago, nor did it immediately correct all injustices. Yet it represented progress born from sacrifice. The path toward equality within the armed forces was shaped by countless acts of courage, both on the battlefield and within courtrooms. Port Chicago stands among those turning points, reminding us that reform often emerges from tragedy and that the pursuit of justice can reshape institutions once thought immovable. In the decades following World War II, the story of Port Chicago faded from national headlines, but its impact continued to ripple quietly through American history. For many years, the disaster and the mutiny trial remained largely absent from textbooks and public memory. The sailors who had been convicted carried the weight of their sentences long after their release. Some struggled to rebuild their lives under the shadow of dishonorable discharges, while others rarely spoke of the trauma they endured. The silence surrounding the event reflected a broader reluctance to confront uncomfortable truths about race and injustice within the military. Yet the legacy of Port Chicago persisted beneath that silence. Historians, veterans, and civil rights advocates gradually revisited the case. They examined trial transcripts, survivor accounts, and Navy records, piecing together a fuller picture of what had occurred. These efforts revealed not only the scale of the explosion, but the systemic failures that had made it possible. The disaster became an important case study in how institutional inequality can magnify risk and erode trust. For surviving sailors, the memory of that night remained vivid. Many carried physical scars from burns and injuries. Others bore psychological wounds that lingered for decades. The trauma of witnessing friends killed in an instant could not be easily erased. Some veterans later spoke publicly, determined that the men who died would not be forgotten. Their testimonies added depth and humanity to the historical record, ensuring that Port Chicago was remembered as more than a statistic. In time, the convicted sailors received reconsideration. In 1999, one of the surviving sailors was officially pardoned, acknowledging that justice had not been fully served. Although the pardon came decades later, it symbolized a step toward historical correction. The site of the disaster was eventually recognized as a memorial, honoring those who lost their lives and those who stood trial. The long-term impact of Port Chicago extends beyond policy reform. It serves as a reminder of the cost of silence and the importance of accountability. It underscores how institutions can evolve when confronted with evidence of injustice. And it demonstrates that even in moments of tragedy, acts of conscience can leave lasting influence. The echoes of Port Chicago continue to inform conversations about equality, military ethics, and the responsibility of leadership to protect those who serve. Today, Port Chicago stands not only as the site of a wartime disaster, but as a place of remembrance and reflection. The shoreline where ships once loaded munitions is quieter now, marked by memorials that honor the 320 men who lost their lives. Engraved names in stone serve as a solemn reminder of sacrifice and the consequences of systemic failure. For decades, many Americans were unaware of this chapter in history, but renewed scholarship and public interest have brought greater visibility to the story. Modern recognition has taken many forms. Educational initiatives, documentaries, and historical research have reintroduced Port Chicago into the national narrative. The disaster is now understood not simply as an explosion, but as a pivotal moment in the struggle for civil rights within the armed forces. The sailors who refused unsafe orders are increasingly viewed through a more nuanced lens, not as mutineers, but as men who confronted impossible circumstances with courage and conviction. The site itself has been designated as a national memorial, ensuring preservation and public access for future generations. Visitors walk the grounds with a deeper awareness of what occurred there, often reflecting on the broader themes of equality and justice. The memorial does not dramatize the past. Instead, it invites contemplation. It asks visitors to consider how fear, authority, prejudice, and bravery intersected on a single night in 1944. The legacy of Port Chicago continues to resonate in contemporary discussions about military ethics and leadership. It serves as a case study in how marginalized voices can challenge institutional norms. It also stands as evidence that reform, though often slow, is possible when injustices are acknowledged and addressed. Perhaps most importantly, modern recognition restores dignity to those who were long overlooked. The men who died in the explosion and those who stood trial are remembered not solely for tragedy, but for their humanity. Their story encourages ongoing vigilance against inequality and complacency. Port Chicago reminds us that patriotism is not only measured by obedience, but also by the courage to demand fairness and safety. In remembering Port Chicago, we honor both sacrifice and resilience. We acknowledge a painful chapter of history while recognizing the progress that followed. The legacy endures as a testament to the enduring pursuit of justice within the American story.